there's a particular problem about thinking about the question as to whether time is real at the moment, which comes from the fact that the word time has become ambiguous in contemporary debates. And if we're not careful to note the ambiguity, it can turn out that we're simply talking past each other in trying to address the question as to whether time is real. So I want to start off by distinguishing two conceptions of time so that we have that clearly on the table in front of us. On the one hand, you could call it the ordinary conception of time, the ordinary human conception of time, and we can distinguish a number of elements to that. One is the idea that the present moment is somehow particularly special. People often say that the present exists, the past and the future don't. The future doesn't yet exist, the past no longer exists. Another aspect of this ordinary conception is that the idea of the flow or passage of time. There seems to be something essentially dynamic about time. And another third element of it, which is again subtly different, I think, is the idea that there's some fundamental sense in which the future is different from the past. So those are all elements of what we might call our ordinary human conception of time. And then in physics we get a conception of time which is very different from that, in that, at least in the view of most physicists, Julian can tell me if I'm wrong, there's no place for any of those three elements in the picture that physics gives us of time. So there's no privileged present moment, there's nothing like a real dynamic flow of time, and there's no deep, at the deep level anyway, there's no deep distinction between the past and the future. Now, but what that means is that if two people are having a discussion about whether time is real or not, they may be talking about different things. Because one of them may be defending the reality of time in the second sense, in the physicist sense, and the other may be attacking it in the ordinary sense. And those two things are, of course, perfectly compatible. So what's happened is we've reached one of those episodes in the history of science or the history of thought where we just have to decide how we want to use a term. It doesn't really matter which way we go. We could invent a new word for the new physicist conception of time. Another example where this has happened is the word atom. I mean, as it was originally introduced by the Greeks, it meant something indivisible. But nobody these days thinks that atoms are indivisible. But so at some point we had a choice point. We had a choice about whether to continue using the term atom for the small things which were playing a role in 19th and early 20th century physics. Where, as it turned out, we went on calling them atoms even though they weren't divisible. And we have a similar choice in the case of time. So when we're talking today about whether time is real, we need to be very careful about which kind of time we're talking about, whether we're talking about the time of ordinary experience, which has a distinguished present moment, a sense of flow, and a difference between the past and future, or whether we're talking about time in the physicist sense, which doesn't have any of those things. One of the things I wanted to say about space, as I said at the beginning, is that we have to be very careful that we're not dealing with an ambiguity, and that as we look at the trajectory from our ordinary conception of space, what, as Julian says, we may have because we tend to live in environments with solid objects, things like walls in them. If we move from that to the kind of picture of space that Julian was offering us in this, done in these elegant mathematical terms, we can, if we want, continue using the term space, but we have to recognize that we've also got the option to simply talk, to invent a different word and say, we've given up on that one. We've decided to use this one instead. So we shouldn't make the mistake of thinking that there's a single thing whose essence we're trying to understand all along. So that's what I wanted to say about space, as I said it about time. Now, coming to the question of reality of what's out there, I think we have to have a similar caution about that kind of metaphor of things being either out there or not. I mean, one way to think about it is in terms of the notion of the world. I think the notion of the world is a notion that does a lot of harm in philosophy because people don't reflect on it enough. Here's one thing that you might mean by out there. You might mean the question as to whether something is true or not is, in some sense, independent of us. So the question as to whether it's noisy in here is independent of us. It's just at the moment it's not. There's a fact about that. But it's a fact to understand which we have to think about the fact that humans have ears and so on. So there's a kind of human ingredient in it. Similarly, if we talk about colours. Now, that's not a sharp divide that we can put things on one side or the other. It's a continuum, and I want to say that when we're asking when we're asking in blunt terms the question, is something really out there, we're making the mistake of thinking of that as a sharp bifurcation, where it's really a continuum. And what we can say, I think, is that the kinds of notions used in advanced science, or the kind of picture of space that Julian was giving us, is a lot less infected with distinctively human ways of thinking than talking of noise or colour or smells. And that's a kind of clarification which has been going on for centuries, at least since the 17th century. And it's what the 20th century philosopher, great American philosopher Wilfrid Sellars, called the distinction between the manifest image, the ordinary sort of picture of the world we have, and the scientific image. But there's no reason to think of that as a sharp line. And that's the respect in which I was objecting to the way in which you were putting that question. I would want to say that the time as a river thing is much more part of what Sellars called the manifest image. So it involves our ordinary human ways of thinking about time much more than the scientific picture does. Because I don't want to end up in the position of denying the ordinary sorts of things that we say, like we say, it's now Friday afternoon. That's perfectly true. Well, I didn't make that up. We can say that's a fact. It's Friday afternoon. But that involves a reference to what time it is now, which is something that we can only say because we are kind of creatures who are embedded in time in a particular way. So one of the characteristics of this, what I was trying to portray as a kind of gradual gradation from the more human-centric concepts at one end to the more scientific concepts at the other, is that at the subjective end, or the human-centric end, we have concepts whose use depends on various kinds of contingencies about us, on the fact that we have locations in space and time, things of that kind. Or, as Julian says, the fact that we happen to live in environments with fixed, or what seem to us as fixed physical objects in them. Whereas the scientific view of the world is a view which depends on fewer and fewer of those contingencies. But it's basically a continuum.
And do you want to privilege one of those?
No,
or
not at all.
And are all of these just or alternative ways of talking about it? Like
they're not alternatives in the sense that you have to choose one or the other. They're different ways of speaking, and if you're interested in the scientific project of finding a way of speaking which sort of detaches itself from the contingencies of our viewpoint, then you should learn to speak in the scientific way.
But now, I would say, I think there is a notion of now. It is just, so to speak, that the universe is like this now. That is our now. But the universe is now different, and this is our now. I don't see. Einstein said he was terribly. The reason why Einstein was worried about there's no place for now was because he denied a notion of simultaneity. But I think there is a representation of Einstein's theory where you restore a notion of simultaneity, but you take out size and you only look at shapes. So I think it will be possible to talk about now. And I think Einstein's great concern about there being no place for now in the modern worldview is just mistaken. It's always, we are in a particular now, and it's constantly different. It's a wonderful world.
I just want to take Julian up on the last point there, because I want to put the now towards the more human-centric end rather than towards the more scientific end. The way I like to make the point is to say, look, Julian, if I asked you to tell me what you did last week or what the universe was like last week, then in terms of your picture, you'd show me the diagrams that represented the temporal stages of all of the days of last week. You haven't left anything out if you haven't pointed to any one of those diagrams as representing the now. Indeed, if I said to you, well, you've told me all about last week, but you haven't said which of those days was now, Obviously, the only answer you can give is, well, each of them was now when
Yes.
it happened.
Oh, absolutely. The world, the space of possibilities is all possible nows, and we're lucky enough to be in one of them, and it's damned marvelous, frankly. That is the space of all possibilities. It's all possible nows. And one other thing is this accumulation. The nows are very wonderful, because in some senses what is inside my brain is not only this picture, but there's also pictures of these other nows that we think were in the past. So they're all there at once in some senses. This is why I know what Hugh looks like.
Let me have one more. I've just picked up two of these frames at random, these frames from a movie, as you said. Now, we want this to think of this as a complete movie, so we want you to be in the movie, not outside it.
Yes.
Which of these frames are you in?
I'm in both.
Exactly. So neither is privileged from your point of view. Each one is privileged from the point of view of the particular version of you which is in that one, but that's true of the version of you which is in that one as well. When you look at the description of the universe, no one of those frames is picked out. It's only
this is the gorgeous thing. There are many Julians, and there are all of us. There are many of us. They're all the experiences. They're all the moments in which we've lived.
Yes, I know, but in that sense, there are many nows, and no single now is picked out from the point of view of the universe.
How do we separate these? You had two versions. The wanting to separate the personal, as it were, from the scientific account.
I insisted that it shouldn't be seen as a sharp separation. It should be seen as more of a gradation.
So how do we tease these out? How much of Julian's account there do you think is in on the frames of thought bit, and how much of it do you think is to do with what's going on? I don't know how to refer to it since you've cautioned me on describing it as out there.
Well, I would say that what Julian was illustrating by using these to illustrate the idea of the kind of description which his version of physics would give us of spatial relations and so on. That's pretty much as far at the opposite end of the spectrum from the human-centric stuff as it's at this stage possible for us to be. But then when he wanted to put the now into it, I thought he was confusing that with something which I would want to regard as being very much at the opposite end of the spectrum. So you might have a conception of things which were real but which were not spatio-temporal.
Yes.
So you might think that, many people have thought that mathematics lives in some other realm which is not a spatial realm.
So do you think there is an alternative realm which is not one which falls within a framework? Can we think in a way which is not within a spatio-temporal framework?
I certainly think we can think of things which are not spatio-temporal, and I would give numbers as an example. Now, my own view is it's not the traditional Platonic view that numbers exist in Plato's heaven. That seems to me to have too much of the sort of residue of among other things, of a quasi-spatial picture. You're thinking of the numbers having to exist in some sense somewhere, although it's not, strictly speaking, in space. I'd rather take a much more relaxed view and think about how we come to talk that way, and tie it in with my relaxed view about the gradation between the subjective or human-centric stuff on one hand, and the more or less objective stuff on the other, and say yes, numbers are a perfectly good example of something that we talk about which is not in space. And I would say that the value is another thing that we talk about.
So we can think the idea, can we, of something that's not temporal?
Yes, certainly we can. Roughly speaking, the only kinds of things that have to exist in space and time are sort of physical matter, things of that kind. But lots of things that we talk about are not of that kind.
I'm saying I am the entire universe, but Leibniz has this wonderful picture of when you're at some distance from the sea, you hear the confused noise of the waves breaking on the shore. And so all the details are at a level where you can't pick it up easily. You can only pick up some things close to you, so that it's that confused noise. But Leibniz makes the claim, we are literally the whole universe. And I think there may well be a case for that. The fact that if you go back and say, what is the information that is actually determining our universe, which solution of Einstein's equations we live in, actually that predetermines, or quantum mechanics, to a large degree determines what we are. So